At 90 years old, he knew he had only seconds to react. The bear was already coming back. Blood soaked through the sleeve of his flannel shirt. His right leg wouldn't hold his weight anymore. Somewhere behind him, a walking stick lay broken in the dirt, the only weapon he had. He was alone. Miles from the nearest road, no phone signal, no one expecting him back for days. And the animal that had already knocked him to the ground once was standing between him and the only trail home. How does a man who has lived 9 decades survive a second encounter with an 800-pound predator? And if he does, how does he survive the 7 days that come after? This is that story. His name was Walter. He was 90 years old, and he had spent more of his life outdoors than most people spend awake. Walter wasn't the kind of 90-year-old people expected. He didn't shuffle. He didn't need a cane in town. He split his own firewood every autumn, and he still hiked the ridgeline behind his property most mornings before breakfast. He'd grown up in a logging family in the Rocky Mountains, the kind of childhood where a boy learned to read weather before he learned to read books. He'd spent decades hunting elk in early snow, fishing alpine lakes his grandchildren couldn't pronounce, and walking trails that didn't exist on any map, only in his memory. His family worried, sure. His daughter had asked him more than once to stop hiking alone. But Walter would just smile and say the mountains were the one place his body still remembered how to be young. That week, he'd told his son he was heading up to a familiar stretch of backcountry he'd walked 100 times before, a short overnight trip, nothing dramatic. 2 days, maybe 3. He packed light, confident, experienced. He had no idea it would become the longest week of his life. The journey begins. The trailhead sat at the edge of a dense pine forest. The kind of wilderness where the temperature can drop 15 degrees the moment the sun dips behind a ridge. Walter started up the trail in the cool of early morning. Mist clung low between the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled over a valley carved by an old river. The higher he climbed, the quieter the world became. Just boots on packed dirt, the creak of his pack straps, and the occasional snap of a branch under his own weight. This was remote country, the kind of place where cell service disappears within the first mile, and rescue crews, if ever needed, would measure response time in hours, not minutes. He knew the risks. He'd always known them. That was part of why he kept coming back. But nothing in 90 years of mountain experience had prepared him for what was waiting 2 days up the trail. The first attack by the second afternoon, something felt wrong. The forest had gone still. No birdsong, no rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. Just a heavy, watching silence that Walter had learned, over decades, never to ignore. Then he saw it, a set of tracks pressed deep into soft mud beside the trail. Fresh. Large. A claw mark gouged into a nearby tree trunk, well above his own head height. Bear country. He'd known that going in, but knowing and encountering are two very different things. He kept moving, slower now, talking aloud to himself the way experienced hikers do to avoid startling wildlife. He rounded a bend where the trail narrowed between thick brush, and there it was. A black bear, no more than 30 feet away, raised its head from a patch of berries. For a moment, neither of them moved. Walter began backing away slowly, the way he'd been taught a lifetime ago. But the bear didn't retreat. It huffed, dropped to all fours, and closed the distance faster than a man of any age could outrun. The impact knocked him off the trail and down a short embankment. Claws raked across his arm. He remembers rolling, the world spinning between sky and dirt, his backpack absorbing part of the blow to his back. Then, as suddenly as it started, it was over. The bear retreated into the brush, leaving Walter alone at the bottom of the slope, bleeding, winded, and far from any trail marker. He pressed a hand against the gash on his arm and tried to stand. His leg wouldn't cooperate. Something was wrong below the knee. And somewhere above him, in the tree line, he could still hear movement. The second attack. Walter didn't know why the bear came back. Wildlife experts caution that bear behavior is unpredictable, and no one can say for certain what drove the animal to return, whether it was still guarding the berry patch, reacting to the smell of blood, or simple chance. What's certain is what Walter experienced. The sound of brush snapping again, closer this time, only minutes after the first attack. He was still on the ground, his leg unable to bear weight, when the bear reappeared at the top of the embankment. This time, there was no 30 feet of distance, no time to back away. Walter grabbed the only thing within reach, a heavy fallen branch, and did the only thing his body would still let him do. He made himself as large as he could, shouted with everything he had left in his lungs, and swung. The next several seconds are, by his own account, a blur, a second collision. Teeth and claws, the branch splintering in his hands, pain radiating through his shoulder inside. And then, somehow, the animal broke off again, startled. Perhaps by the noise, or simply satisfied that the threat was neutralized. It disappeared back into the tree line, and this time it didn't return. And Walter lay in the dirt, chest heaving, blood soaking through a second layer of clothing now. His pack was torn open beside him, its contents scattered across the slope. He had survived the bear twice, but now he had another problem. He had no idea how he was going to survive the next 7 days. The 7-day survival day. 1. Shock set in first. Walter's hands wouldn't stop shaking, though the temperature was mild. He forced himself to inventory his injuries, deep lacerations on his arm and shoulder, a leg that likely wasn't broken, but couldn't bear full weight, and bruising across his ribs that made every breath sharp. He tore strips from a spare shirt to bind his wounds, pressure applied the way he'd learned from a lifetime of minor trail injuries. He was nearly a mile off the marked trail, in unfamiliar terrain, with no working phone signal and a pack half emptied by the fall. He didn't move far that first day. Couldn't. He found a hollow beneath a fallen log, pulled what gear he could recover close to his body, and waited out the daylight, listening for the bear, listening for anything. Night came fast in the mountains. Walter didn't sleep. He watched the tree line and told himself, morning first, then move. Day 2, thirst became the priority. Walter knew the general direction of a creek he'd crossed the day before the attack, a sound more than a memory, a distant trickle he tracked by ear. Dragging his injured leg, using the broken branch as a crutch, it took him most of the morning to cover what would normally have been a 10-minute walk. When he finally reached the water, he drank carefully, cupping it in shaking hands, grateful for something his body still knew how to do on instinct. He filled an old canteen from his scattered gear. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep moving. Day 3. Shelter mattered now more than distance. The nights were dropping into the 40s, and Walter's body, already worn thin by blood loss and shock, couldn't afford another night exposed on open ground. He found a shallow rock overhang near the creek, its floor dry, its opening angled away from the prevailing wind. He gathered pine boughs to insulate the ground beneath him, a trick from childhood, from decades of hunting trips with his father. It wasn't comfortable, but it was cover. That night, for the first time, he allowed himself to think about home, about his daughter's voice on the phone, about whether anyone even knew yet that he hadn't come back on schedule. Day 4. Hunger arrived in full by the 4th day, gnawing and constant. Walter had no food left beyond a few crushed crackers salvaged from his torn pack. He knew better than to risk unfamiliar plants in his weakened state, so he rationed what little he had and focused on conserving energy instead of searching for more. His leg had swollen considerably. Every movement sent pain through his hip. He spent most of the day near the rock shelter, resting, drinking creek water, watching clouds gather over the ridge above him. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard an engine, a truck maybe, or a plane. He couldn't be sure. He didn't have the strength to move toward the sound. Day 5, the weather turned. Rain began before dawn and didn't let up. Walter's shelter, dry until now, started to fail as wind drove moisture sideways beneath the overhang. His clothes soaked through. His body, already weakened by blood loss and hunger, began shivering uncontrollably, the early signs of hypothermia. He knew what that meant. He'd seen it happen to others decades ago, on hunting trips gone wrong. Movement was survival now. He forced himself upright, wrapped himself in what dry material remained, and kept his hands moving, his mind talking, anything to stay conscious through the worst of it. By nightfall, the rain eased. Walter was alive, but barely warmer than the storm that had just passed through him. Day 6 hope, for the first time, began to slip. Walter's voice, when he tried to call out, came out as barely more than a whisper. Leg had stiffened badly. Infection was setting into his wounds, a heat under the skin that hadn't been there before. He drifted in and out of sleep through the day, waking each time unsure how much time had passed. He thought about his late wife, about the mountains they'd hiked together decades earlier, before her passing, about whether this ridge would be the last one he ever saw. But something in him refused to let that be the final thought. He forced himself to eat the last of his crackers. He forced himself to drink. As evening fell, he made a decision. Tomorrow, whatever it cost him, he would move toward the main trail, not wait for rescue, but go find it. Day 7. Walter woke before sunrise, his body barely responding to his own commands. He used the last of his strength to stand, leaning on the same broken branch that had helped fight off the bear a week earlier. Step by step, he made his way back toward where he believed the main trail lay, guided by memory, by the sound of the creek, by nothing more than stubborn will. He didn't know it yet, but that same morning, a search and rescue team, alerted days earlier by his worried family, had begun narrowing their search to this exact stretch of forest. The lowest moment. Somewhere in those final hours, Walter's legs gave out completely. He collapsed against a boulder just off what he believed was the trail, his body finally refusing to go any further. 7 days of blood loss, infection, hunger, and cold had taken almost everything he had. He has since described that moment quietly, without exaggeration, the feeling of his body simply reaching its limit, and the strange calm that came with accepting it. But even then, something kept him from closing his eyes for good. He thought of his daughter's face, of grandchildren who still called him for hiking advice, of a lifetime spent believing that the mountains, for all their danger, had never once truly beaten him. He wasn't ready to let this be the first time. So he did the only thing left in his power. He made noise. Weak, hoarse shouts, spaced out over what strength he had, not because he believed anyone was close, but because giving up wasn't a decision his body would let him make quietly. The search team heard him before they saw him. A faint, broken sound carried on the wind, coming from somewhere below the ridgeline they were combing. They changed direction, moving fast through dense brush toward the noise. They found Walter slumped against the boulder, barely conscious, his clothing torn, his wounds days old and badly infected, his body pushed to the edge of hypothermia and exhaustion. For a moment the rescuers simply stared, stunned that a man his age had not only survived to bear encounters, but 7 days alone in rugged terrain afterward. They stabilized him where he lay, then carried him out to a waiting helicopter for evacuation to the nearest hospital. The rotor wash flattening the pine boughs around them as Walter was lifted. At last out of the wilderness that had nearly claimed him. Aftermath: Walter spent weeks recovering in the hospital. His wounds required extensive treatment. And doctors credited his survival to a combination of quick action in the first hours, decades of outdoor experience, and frankly, sheer will. When asked about the experience afterward, Walter didn't talk about fear. He talked about the mountains, about how they had given him nearly everything good in his life, and how, even at his lowest, he never once blamed them for what happened. His family says he's slower now. The injuries left lasting damage. But his spirit, they say, hasn't changed at all. Search and rescue teams later pointed to his story as a reminder that survival instincts, decision-making, and sheer determination don't fade with age. Sometimes they're sharpened by it. Final message. Walter's story isn't really about a bear. It's about what happens when a lifetime of quiet preparation meets a moment no one can ever fully prepare for. It's about the difference between giving in and refusing to. At 90 years old, he didn't survive because he was stronger than the wilderness. He survived because he understood it, and because somewhere inside him there was still a reason to keep fighting for one more sunrise. Age didn't stop him. It's what carried him through. Stories like this remind us that survival is not always about strength. Sometimes it is about experience, patience, and refusing to give up. If you enjoy incredible survival stories from America and around the world, subscribe to Elder Survival.